U.S. government officials expect a major influx of migrants at the U.S. Mexico border now that a pandemic-era policy is expiring. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Title 42, as it's known, is officially winding down. The controversial program went into effect during the height of the COVID-19 crisis 3 years ago. The Trump administration used the provision to turn away migrants at the southern border, citing health and the safety of Americans. A provision known as Title 8 will take its place. Well, joining us now from Mexico is CGTN's Frank Contreras. Frank, great to see you. What's the latest right now at the Mexican border? What are you seeing?
Thank you, Anand. We're standing here on the Ciudad Juarez side of the border. Just behind me, you see a body of water, a small green body of water. That's the actual border between Mexico and the United States. Now, behind that, you can see some razor wire, and behind the razor wire, a large group of migrants. They've been camped out here for days now, Anand. Now, the last few hours have really shown quite a big switch in what's taking place here. A dramatic switch, I would call it. We're now hours away from the expiration of Title 42. It gave the United States the right to deport people, citing public health security issues during the pandemic. And as you pointed out, that's about to expire at midnight Eastern time. Now, today, what we're seeing are a large group of migrants behind me. The majority of those are probably Venezuelans. We're talking about somewhere around 400 people in this group alone here. And essentially what happened earlier today was the Texas National Guard troops came. They had set up razor wire. They closed off an area where migrants were crossing back into Mexico. The migrants, as I say, have been camped out for days. And so they've been coming back into Mexico to purchase water, to get food, basic supplies, things like that. Well, the National Guard on the Texas side sealed off their entrances, basically locking the migrants into a sort of corralled off area. And then what happened was they started to line them up, and very soon they began the procedure of doing what they call processing the migrants. For the migrants, that was quite good news. They thought that meant that they were about to enter the promised land. Some of them have traveled as far away, walking through the Americas from as far away as Venezuela. You remember what happened to Venezuela even before the pandemic. Venezuela's economy was in tragic situation. Extreme poverty was already growing. Once the pandemic hit, it really started to send people looking elsewhere, outside of the national borders of Venezuela, to try to find a way to make a living. And so since 2015, more than 7 million Venezuelans have left their homeland. Many of them now are in Mexico. And so today we saw them turning themselves in on their own voluntary decision to U.S. immigration authorities. The first step, they were told to throw away all of their personal belongings, any blankets, clothing, water bottles, any sort of backpacks they may have been carrying all of this way along their journey. Coming here to the U.S. Mexico border, they were asked to throw that away. The next part of the process is they will be taken across the border into the United States. They will have their fingerprints taken, probably some photographs taken, and they will then become registered legally into the immigration system of the United States government. What they don't know is probably the vast majority of those Latin American migrants will probably be deported back to Mexico or other parts of Latin America, Anand.
So, Frank, as you say, at midnight, once Title 42, this policy expires, these migrants will be allowed into the United States, where they will be processed. Now, what happens then while their applications for asylum are being considered?
Well, what we're looking at here is the possibility of somewhere around 65,000 migrants all along the Mexican side of the border, hoping to get into the United States. And so on the United States side, they're expecting that the already heavily burdened immigration system. We know the courts there have been bogged down with immigration cases now for years. That is only going to get more intense for the U.S. immigration system. And so there's a good possibility that some of the migrants, as they're being processed, will be allowed to enter the United States and basically await their time to stand before an immigration judge.
Right.
But as I said, the immigration courts in the United States are bogged down. The United States still has the possibility under something called Title VIII to actually deport anybody who does not have proper immigration documents. So that's what's happening now. We're starting to see a switch in the U.S. government, the Biden administration policy, to start moving toward the use of Title VIII, and basically we're going to see more immigration deportations.
Yeah.
And so that is pretty much what they can expect on that side of the border.
Okay, Frank, thanks a lot. That's CGTN's Frank Contreras reporting from the Mexico-U.S. border. Well, to continue our conversation, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Mexico City, Laura Carlsen is the director of the Americas program. Here in Washington, D.C., Rafael Bernal is a staff writer at The Hill newspaper. Mark Krikorian is the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies. And from Cleveland, Ohio, David Leopold is partner and chair at the immigration law group Ulmer and Berne LLP. Well, welcome to you, all of you, to the show. David Leopold, let me start with you. So we have Title 42, which is going to be expiring in just a few hours at midnight here in the Eastern Time Zone in the United States, and that will be replaced by Title 8. What is the major difference between these two?
Well, Title 8 is the immigration law. That's the short term for the immigration statute. The difference is due process. The difference is applying the law that Congress passed. Title 42 was a pretext that was used by the Trump administration to avoid the law, to avoid the immigration law. And the immigration law is basically designed, we'll get into that later, but the immigration law is the law that your reporter there, Frank, was referring to in terms of going before the immigration judges, in terms of having a hearing, and so forth. So that's the difference. What's happening is since Title 42, the health statute, is being withdrawn, is expiring, the regular immigration law will take over. That's the law that's always been in place. That's also the law that badly needs to be reformed, because it was written many years ago and not to accommodate a situation like we have today at the border. So it needs to be updated badly.
Right. So, David, Title 42 was, is it fair to assume that it was a deterrent to immigrants or migrants coming to the border?
Well, actually, it wasn't. We're finding that under Title 42, there was a high recidivism rate. Why? Because there was no paper. People were just expelled. There was no deportation order. There was no record. That's the difference, and I think that's been pointed out by the Biden administration. The Title 8, the immigration statute, as these folks are taken into custody, and as Frank pointed out in the opening, will be fingerprinted, will be processed when they are deported. And he's correct. Most of them will not qualify for asylum. Those that don't qualify for asylum will be deported if they have no other relief from deportation. If they do come back under Title 8, they're facing much more harsh repercussions, including criminal sanctions for reentry, illegal reentry after deportation, which is a felony. Under Title 42, when they were expelled, if they came back, there were no repercussions. So Title 42, the downside of Title 42 was it pretty much eviscerated asylum. There was no way to protect people who need humanitarian protection. They were turning away people at the border who really needed to be given their day in court to see if they had a viable asylum claim. Title 42 was a disaster because a lot of folks bottled up in Mexico, bottled up waiting in squalor. Yeah. You can see it there in the pictures. That's some of what you see. And it was a disaster over the last 3 years. And it's a good thing that's being lifted. But let's remember, Title 8 isn't enough. We need to reform the immigration law to make it work for our entire country.
Mark Krikorian, what is your view on the switching of these provisions? I mean, we had Title 42, which was a public health provision now being replaced by Title VIII, which, as David just pointed out, is immigration law. So the United States now reverts to immigration law. But do you think that the effect will be the same?
Title 42 had to be lifted because, as you said, it's a public health measure. The public health emergency, if there even was one, is long, long past. But the idea that every illegal immigrant was dealt with under this public health provision, under Title 42, that allowed the Border Patrol to just bounce people back into Mexico without hearings, is a mistake. Under Trump, well over 80% of the people, illegal immigrants, were in fact expelled under Title 42. But under Biden, it's most of them have not been expelled under Title 42. Many have. I mean, there's no question about it, but most were not. So that even before this change, the majority of illegal border crossers were dealt with under the normal immigration law, which is what everybody is pointing out is in Title VIII. I mean, it's sort of remarkable. Nobody ever used that title before. But the fact is that they're being let go. This administration, since it took over, has taken into custody and then released into the United States more than 2 million illegal border crossers.
Right.
And this is not going to change. If anything, it's likely to increase under the new arrangements because they are being overwhelmed. The past few days, there have been 10,000 illegal immigrant apprehensions a day at the border, which is a record that's never have been that high. And just to give a little context, President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, said that even 1,000 illegal alien apprehensions a day on the border strained the system. It overwhelmed their capacity. They're now dealing with 10,000 a day, and they're literally just releasing them into the United States on the streets. And so, this is not a solution and is not going to get control over what we're seeing at the border.
Laura Carlsen, according to United States Customs and Border Protection sources, both the Trump and Biden administrations used Title 42, and we just heard that from Mark. They used it more than 2 million, in fact 2.8 million times. That means that migrants who came up to the border were turned back into Mexico. Do we know of their fate? What happened when they were turned back?
Well, first, we have to break down some of the myths and the lies, the outright lies in this whole immigration debate that we're seeing. Title 42 had to end. It was always illegal because it was the bogus use of a health measure as an anti-immigration measure. It should never have been allowed to go into practice in the first place. So Biden comes into office, he lifts it, it goes into the courts, and now finally, since the pandemic's been declared over in the entire world, it's inevitable that it be lifted, and it's lifted at 11:59. The statistic that 80% of Title 42 people went back, under the Trump administration, or is very difficult. I mean, of illegal immigrants were sent back under that. It's very difficult to sustain because the whole idea of undocumented immigrants going into the United States and staying there has to do with the fact that they're undetected at the time. The things that change under this is that, as we mentioned, Title VIII goes into effect, and there's a processing procedure for the immigrants to go, and they're at least restored on paper their right to request asylum, which is a universal right. Anyone who's fleeing danger has the right to seek safety for themselves and their family. It's fundamental to our understanding of human rights and of immigration as well. So now that goes into effect, but there are so many restrictions in this that it's very difficult to know whether the situation will be better or not for people who are fleeing danger, which are thousands and thousands of people because of the situations in their home countries. Then, when to the question of what they're coming back to in Mexico, and it's not like the border opens at 11:59 and those 65,000 people that Frank talked about, go rushing across. That's another one of the myths that sometimes sometimes are propagated in the press, there's still these procedures. There's a new app that they have to use called CV1. They're putting into effect regional processing centers, which mean they're going to start in Guatemala and Colombia, that they have to process their initial claims there and then go to request audience in the United States. So there's a number of boundaries are put up. And meanwhile, the burden of these people who are fleeing is being reverted back to Mexico, which we saw that with the Remain in Mexico program. There's not support for dealing with the numbers that we're seeing coming up. And it's also reverted to other countries that are even in a less with fewer possibilities of being able to attend to the humanitarian needs of these people. So we're creating another bottleneck in the name of border security that's not related to real security. We're talking about families. We're talking about people who are fleeing danger. There's no national security threat to migration flows to the United States. What there is a complete and total administrative breakdown that has to be dealt with by providing sufficient funds for the fair and legally mandated processing of asylum claims.
All right. Rafael, Bernal, so here we have immigration law now being invoked by the Biden administration. Title 8 is being used, but as I pointed out, there were 2.8 million people who were turned back using Title 42. Theoretically, can they now return to the border and claim asylum?
Well, there weren't 2.8 million people turned back. As David pointed out, there was a lot of recidivism. So there were 2.8 million turned backs under Title 42. Anybody can claim asylum in the United States. That's the any foreign national on U.S. soil for whatever reason has the right to claim asylum. That's the basis of asylum law, and it is sort of the fundamental underpinning of asylum law. Without that right, it's not asylum. It's just another visa essentially. So I mean, technically, yes, they can return and claim asylum, but it is being made very difficult for them to claim asylum if they decide to cross the border, as they did when they were expelled under Title 42. The Biden administration is putting a lot of blocks to who can claim asylum, not banning asylum quite in not calling it an asylum ban. But according to some people, some progressives, it basically amounts, the new blocks amount to an asylum ban. So, but they are opening up these new avenues of parole that might help stem the number of people who actually cross physically at the border. But what we have to remember is Title 42, it's not that big of a policy change. It's been lionized as the be-all, end-all solution to the border. Yeah. But everyone agrees that it was a flawed policy. It was flawed for starters because it was passed off as a public health measure when it wasn't. And these expulsions that cause recidivism just made more difficult the work of Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. So going back to Title 8 in that sense is good news, but Title 42 did create that bottleneck of people who think they have a valid asylum claim, but they were not able to get to the United States, and well, they were not able to make their claim.
David, as Rafael points out, the Biden administration, in using Title 8 right now, has put blocks or obstacles in the way of claiming asylum. What does that mean? Have they just tightened the criteria?
No, they issued a rule yesterday. It came out. It had been, we knew it was coming. And basically, it's correct. For all intents and purposes, it's what we call a transit ban, or it is an asylum ban. What it basically says is that if somebody transits, if coming from Guatemala or Central America, anywhere in Central America, anywhere, and you transit through Mexico and come up to the southern border, if you go through a country to which you're not a resident or a citizen, you are now presumed to be ineligible to apply for asylum in the United States. So the majority of people come up that way
Yeah.
from the South are going to be technically, legally ineligible for asylum. Now, that said, there are some exceptions: unaccompanied minors, people who enter legally through the parole system, people who enter at a designated time at a port of entry, as was pointed out by Laura, with the CBP1 app, which, by the way, barely works. That's a whole nother story. So there are exceptions to it, but the bottom line is that if somebody transits through a third country, right, and most of these folks are in that category, and they come up through the southern border through this period of time, they are going to be presumed ineligible. And that ineligibility, there's appeal processes and so forth, but that ineligibility will follow them and could bite them years down the road. And when I say years down the road, look, the immigration court system in our country is backlogged by over 2 million. I think it's 2.1 million cases in the immigration court system. It's overwhelmed. Laura's correct. The system is overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. In 2013 was the last time there was any kind of bipartisan effort at comprehensive immigration reform. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't have this problem today if the Republicans at that time didn't stop immigration reform. There was plenty of enforcement money, and that eventually came to be in the last 10 years. But what we're not talking about is the need for immigration reform. And the people who oppose immigration, they don't have solutions. This is about shutting down immigration for the restrictionists and the opponents of immigration. That's what's going on. And by the way, one other thing I wanted to say, to enter the country and apply for asylum, as Rafael points out, is not illegal. These are not, quote, illegal aliens. That is an incorrect statement.
Yeah.
These people are asylum applicants. The law is clear. You do not have to enter the United States at a port of entry. You can enter between ports of entry. You are still lawfully applying for asylum. So let's call them what they are. These are asylum applicants.
Yeah.
These are not illegal.
Right.
No human being is illegal, and I resent that term.
Okay. Mark Krikorian, the United States Secretary for Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, he's been talking about the immigration system. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We are taking this approach within the constraints of a broken immigration system that Congress has not fixed for more than 2 decades. And without the resources we need, personnel, facilities, transportation, and others that we have requested of Congress and that we were not given.
So, Mark, we got Mayorkas there talking about a broken immigration system. And as David pointed out a moment ago, the last time there was an effort to reform the system in 2013, well, that died in the U.S. House of Representatives. We've heard of the broken system. What is the legislative fix, in your view, that needs to be made?
Broken system is a lobbyist propaganda label. The fact is, our laws exist and are not being enforced. I have plenty of legislative proposals, changes that I think should be made, and others do as well. But our system is intentionally being undermined by those people in charge of enforcing the law. Every person who crosses the border without inspection, which is to say crosses in between the ports of entry, is an illegal immigrant, and they then apply for asylum in many cases. That's fine, they're still illegal immigrants. But the basic point here, I think... How
are they illegal if they're applying for asylum?
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. The issue of asylum is central here. The administration's rule on limiting asylum eligibility for people who've crossed through other countries is in theory good, but it's completely loaded with exceptions that will swallow the rule. Right. But the principle is, the issue is that if you have crossed through another country where you could have applied for asylum but did not, you are no longer, morally speaking, a legitimate asylum seeker. Mexico is an upper middle income country. Okay. Mexico has its own asylum system. It is a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention and Protocol, and therefore anyone who has passed through Mexico should not even be permitted to apply for asylum.
Okay, Mark, David, can I get a very quick clarification on what Mark just said? Yeah, that you apply for asylum in the first country that you land in.
Yeah, and that's a misstatement of the law. Mark should read the law. What the law says and what Congress passed was provisions that do limit asylum for people who are firmly resettled in a third country. Okay. It's called firm resettlement, and there's some other exceptions in the statute. The point is, Congress did not say that there should be a transit ban. They did not say that.
Yeah. Okay.
That's in the law. Let's go lobby for that. But that's not in the law. So let's not pretend.
I am running out of time. I need to get to Laura Carlsen. Laura, as I understand it, Title VIII would require the cooperation of the Mexican government. What is the view in Mexico on what's happening?
Mexico has gone along with plans in the United States. Title VIII does not, since it doesn't have a Remain in Mexico component, although that's what the Republican passed in Congress today, it doesn't require that Mexico say, okay, we'll take those people back. But there are other aspects of it that do. And so far, Mexico has gone along with that. However, Mexico has always put the emphasis on addressing the root causes of what's causing that migration. Yep. And that's why this universal right to cross any border and request migration when you're in danger is internationally recognized. And so the construction of the ways that have been ad hoc invented to deal with the crisis in many of the countries are what are creating so many contradictions and so much human misery and suffering right now. It's very rare that we look at this process or this whole issue from the point of view of what migrant families are going through, but we really need to.
Rafael, I've only got about a minute left. There was a measure which was taken by the Biden administration not so long ago where they said, look, one of the ways in which we could counter this is to make more investments in the countries affected. Take away the reasons for migrants to arrive at the border. What happened to that?
Well, it's still going on, but the real problem with that is it's in the best case scenario, it's a medium-term solution, probably more like a long-term solution, and the problem of people amassing at the border and living in unsanitary conditions and frankly just being immiserated within Mexico is happening now. That program could eventually help. It requires some reform in many Central American countries that with shaky democratic credentials sometimes, but it's not a solution to the current flows of migrants in the hemisphere.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.